Hey guys, tonight we begin with a topic a little less philosophical and a lot more greasy. Medieval junk food. Yes, even in a world without fast food chains, vending machines, or hot dog carts, people still found ways to snack. And let me tell you, some of it was delicious, some of it was disturbing, all of it was deeply medieval. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In a world where most snacks looked suspicious and tasted worse, apple fritters were a rare win. Sweet, hot, and slightly dangerous. Just like every good medieval decision, these golden little pucks were the closest thing to a medieval donut, minus the frosting and food safety standards. So what exactly went into a fritter back then? Apples, obviously, but not the shiny, polished supermarket kind. Think small, tart, knobbly things that grew behind the alehouse and may or may not have been stolen from a neighbor's tree. They were chopped up, tossed in a rough batter of flour, eggs, and sometimes ale, because water was always a gamble, and ale made everything feel slightly more cheerful. Then came the fry. Deep frying in the 1300s was a special kind of drama. The oil, usually pig fat, was reused until it could probably vote. It added flavor, which is a generous word for it, but the result was something hot, crispy, and oddly addictive. A fritter fresh out of the pan was a little piece of joy. Crispy edges, soft center, and a faint risk of third-degree burns. If you were lucky and rich, it might be dusted with imported sugar, a luxury that doubled as a social flex. For everyone else, a drizzle of honey or spiced syrup did the trick. Either way, it was sweet enough to distract you from the rest of your diet, which mostly involved cabbage pretending to be other things. Fritters were street food. You'd grab one at a fair, after church, or on market days when you needed a treat and didn't mind grease on your tunic. Kids loved them. Adults loved them. Birds tried to steal them. They were fun, fast, and just indulgent enough to make you forget about the pickled turnips waiting at home. And yes, sometimes they were overcooked, or the apples were more sour than sweet, or the batter was suspiciously chewy. But when they were good, they were really good. One bite in, and suddenly you understood why people put up with medieval life. If apple fritters were the medieval version of a donut, then cheese curds were, well, sort of the medieval popcorn, bite-sized, slightly squeaky, and wildly inconsistent. They weren't flashy, they didn't melt, they didn't stretch. In fact, they barely did anything at all, and that's what made them perfect. Let's be clear, medieval cheese wasn't aiming for Instagram glory. It was made fast, eaten faster, and expected to survive long journeys, questionable storage, and the occasional goat stepping on it. Cheese curds were essentially baby cheese, the early, fresh bits before the wheel hardened into something that could double as a building material. These little clumps of dairy joy were a byproduct of the cheese-making process. Farmers would separate milk into curds and whey using rennet, which sounds fancy until you realize it came from the stomach lining of a baby animal. But hey, it worked. The curds were pressed, lightly salted, and then that was it. Cheese curds. Sometimes they were soft, sometimes rubbery, sometimes they squeaked on your teeth like they had a personality, but they were filling, portable, and weirdly satisfying. And in a time where snack usually meant old bread or cold broth, curds felt like a win. Monks loved them, travelers packed them, kids would eat them like candy, assuming the cows had been cooperative that week. You could fry them, crumble them over stews, or just eat them by the handful while pretending not to smell like the inside of a barn. Unlike many medieval foods, cheese curds didn't require a celebration or feast. They weren't saved for holidays or saints' days. They were just there, comforting, familiar, mildly chewy. The friend who always shows up, never overperforms, but is weirdly reliable when everything else falls apart. Did they sometimes taste a little off? Sure. Freshness was a spectrum in the Middle Ages, but with enough salt and enthusiasm, most people didn't complain. Besides, in a world without refrigeration, your standards naturally adjust. So no. Cheese curds weren't glamorous, but they were simple, hearty, and just indulgent enough to count as a treat. In a pinch, they were also excellent for bribing cats and small children. What do you think? Apple fritters or cheese curds? Which medieval snack are you leaning towards so far? Let me know in the comments. Turnips are not dessert. Let's just start there. But in the medieval world, where sugar was expensive, apples weren't always in season, and creative desperation was a major food group. Someone, somewhere, looked at a turnip and thought, what if this were pie? And so the turnip pie was born. Now, to be fair, it wasn't always awful. Sometimes it was even kind of good. Think mashed turnips, hopefully tender, blended with a bit of egg, maybe some honey or dried fruit if the cook was feeling generous, then baked inside a sturdy crust made of flour, water, and ambition. The result, surprisingly edible. At best, it was warm, a little sweet, and had that vaguely comforting root vegetable meets pudding vibe. At worst, it tasted like someone had mistaken livestock feed for a baking ingredient and just rolled with it. Turnip pies were popular for two main reasons. Turnips were cheap, and pie crust could hide a multitude of sins, whether the turnips were overripe, undercooked, or suspiciously bitter. Once you baked them into a pie and added a drizzle of honey, it became peasant cuisine with aspirations. Was it cheesecake? No, but it tried. And in medieval Europe, trying counted for a lot. You'd find these pies at fairs, feast tables, and in particularly enthusiastic monasteries where the monks had a little too much time and a lot of extra root vegetables. Some recipes added spices, nutmeg. If the abbey was rich, pepper. If the cook was chaotic, occasionally, raisins made an appearance, which only confused people further. Nobles didn't eat turnip pie unless they were slumming it for fun or pretending to relate to the common folk for political reasons. But for everyone else, it was dessert, sort of, more like an afterthought with pastry. And yet, despite its questionable logic, the turnip pie endured. People liked it. Or at least, they didn't dislike it enough to stop making it. It was cheap, filling, and mildly sweet, which for medieval food made it basically revolutionary. All right, quick break. If you're enjoying this culinary trip back in time and learning about these, unique medieval snacks, give this video a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time so you don't miss out on more historical deep dives. If the medieval world had a comfort food MVP, it was the meat pasty, a handheld pie stuffed with seasoned meat, tucked into a folded crust, and baked until it was golden brown or slightly scorched. Basically, a medieval hot pocket minus the microwave and plus a genuine sense of danger. The beauty of the pasty was its portability. You could eat it on the road, in the fields, or while watching a public execution. Whatever the day demanded, wrapped in a thick pastry crust, it stayed warm for a while and protected the contents from dirt, rats, and the occasional peasant sneeze. But let's talk about that filling. Meat, in this case, was a flexible term. If you lived near a manor or a hunting estate, you might get pork, mutton, or venison, actual recognizable meat. If not, well, options expanded dramatically. Rabbit, pigeon, eel, hedgehog, anything that once had legs or slithered could be diced, seasoned, and hidden inside pastry with plausible deniability. Spices were often used to enhance flavor, or, more realistically, to distract you from it. Pepper, sage, and garlic helped, but they couldn't completely hide the fact that the meat had been resting for a few days longer than it should have. Still, in a time when refrigeration was a fantasy and lunch was often just bread and onions, a meaty pasty felt indulgent. There were even vegetarian versions, filled with root vegetables, leeks, or cheese for fasting days, or the particularly devout. But make no mistake, the meat ones were the crowd pleasers. They were greasy, hot, and comforting. You didn't ask what was inside, you just ate it and hoped the cook had been in a good mood. And in case you're wondering, yes, people sometimes marked the crust with initials or symbols to claim ownership, especially among miners and laborers. In some places, the crust was extra thick along one edge, so it could be held with dirty hands and then tossed to the spirits. Or, more realistically, to rats. So were they good? Often, yes. Were they mysterious? Always. But that was part of the charm. You didn't eat a meat pasty to feel safe. You ate it because it tasted good, and you were ready to accept the consequences. In a world where brushing your teeth meant rinsing with wine and hoping for the best, candied fennel seeds were the closest thing medieval folks had to breathe mints. Tiny, sugary, and vaguely herbal, they were part treat, part digestive aid, and part dental hazard, all wrapped up in a single, oddly satisfying crunch. These little seeds were typically coated in a hard shell of sugar, which was no small feat in the Middle Ages. Sugar had to be imported, boiled, beaten, and poured by hand, meaning someone, somewhere, really believed in this potential of these tiny snacks. They were especially popular in noble households, where guests might be handed a small dish of them after dinner to freshen the mouth, and probably to distract from the mutton still clinging to their molars. Flavor-wise, fennel seeds had a strong, licorice-like bite. You either loved them or politely swallowed them whole and nodded in gratitude. The sugar coating helped, but there was always that unmistakable herbal kick, the kind of thing that makes you feel both fancy and slightly confused. Candied seeds also had a job to do. Digestion. People believed fennel helped settle the stomach, especially after a heavy meal involving 3 types of bird and an alarming amount of mead. Think of them as the medieval version of chewing gum crossed with Tums, but with more potential to chip a tooth. And yes, they were hard. Like, crack your molar if you're too confident. Hard. You didn't chew candied fennel seeds casually. You tested one first, gently, bit down slowly, listened for cracking sounds, then committed. It was a risk-reward situation every time. While the rich popped them like medieval tic-tacs, common folk occasionally got their hands on knockoff versions, usually involving honey, crushed herbs, and vague optimism. Not quite the same, but good enough to pretend. In the grand lineup of medieval junk food, candied fennel seeds were small but mighty. They didn't fill your belly, but they left a pleasant taste in your mouth and gave the illusion of refinement. Even if you were covered in mud and still had goose grease on your tunic. If medieval desserts had a golden child, it was the honey cake. Sweet, dense, and prone to sticking to everything except your expectations. Honey cakes were what happened when bakers got ambitious, and sugar was still locked in a castle treasury. Honey was the sweetener of the people, assuming those people had bees, access to bees, or weren't afraid of climbing trees and getting stung in the face. These cakes were usually made with flour, water, and generous spoonfuls of honey, or at least what passed for spoonfuls in an era where spoons were mostly used to fight off siblings. The result, a firm, chewy slab that could either be a delightful snack or a makeshift doorstop, depending on how long it had been sitting near the hearth. Spices were sometimes added if the household was feeling wealthy or showing off. Nutmeg, cloves, or cinnamon could give the honey cake a bit of flair. And by flair, we mean the ability to cause an entire village to talk about your recipe for a week. Dried fruits were also tossed in if they hadn't been stolen by the local children or turned into wine. Honey cakes were popular at feasts, festivals, and weddings, mostly because they could be made ahead of time, didn't spoil quickly, and could survive being dropped on the ground, stepped on, or thrown at someone in a mild food fight. They were also used as gifts, bribes, and occasionally passive-aggressive statements. Here, I made this for you. It's sweet. Unlike your personality, structurally, they weren't what you'd call delicate. Many resembled compact bricks. Slicing them required a sturdy knife and the quiet hope that no one was watching you struggle. Eating them was easier. Just don't expect a fluffy bite. These cakes were built for medieval life. Tough, durable, and coated in enough sticky honey to make your hands feel like you lost a battle with a beehive. But they were satisfying. They tasted like warmth and indulgence, like the rare moment you weren't chewing salted barley or chasing rats out of your cupboard. They were joy, wrapped in sugar, with just enough chew to count as cardio. Fried fish, skin cracklings. Possibly the most unexpectedly delightful snack to emerge from a culture that also thought eel pie was a good idea. These crispy, salty little strips weren't glamorous, but they were efficient. Waste not, want not, especially when you're working with a fish that, frankly, smells like it's judging you. Let's be honest, no one set out to invent this. More likely, some thrifty cook was left staring at a pile of discarded fish skins and thought, what if we just fried it? a splash of hot fat later, and history was made, or at least something vaguely edible was born. Fish skin was plentiful, especially in coastal towns or near rivers where herring, cod, or whatever had been pulled out of the water was processed on site. The meat went to the stew pot, the heads went to the cat, and the skin, that got thrown into a pan of bubbling oil and sizzled into submission. The result was surprisingly addictive. A thin, crispy snack that crunched like a dried leaf, but tasted like concentrated ocean. A pinch of salt elevated the experience, a hint of garlic or herbs. Well now, you were flirting with culinary excellence. These cracklings weren't just tasty, they were practical, lightweight, non-perishable-ish, and high in fat. Exactly what a medieval body craved after a day of hauling firewood or defending sheep from someone else's sheep. Soldiers packed them. Sailors lived off them. Peasants sold them outside taverns for a few coins in the satisfaction of feeding drunk people something louder than their conversation. Did they sometimes still have scales? Yes. Did they occasionally curl into weird shapes that made you question your life choices? Also, yes. But by medieval standards, they were downright elegant, crispy, flavorful, and unlikely to give you dysentery. The only real drawback, smell. These things could announce their presence from 3 huts away. If you fried a batch indoors, your home would smell like Poseidon's laundry for a solid week. But you'd be forgiven, because they tasted good. When life gave you stale bread and warm beer, you didn't cry. You made the most medieval snack imaginable, bread soaked in ale, known variously as soaps or trench toast. This humble creation was the original comfort food. Think French toast, but without the eggs, sugar, cinnamon, or joy. Here's how it worked. You took yesterday's bread, the kind that could double as building material, and dunked it into a bowl of ale. Not fancy craft ale with notes of citrus and a hoppy finish. No, this was flat, low-alcohol medieval ale brewed in someone's smoky back room with the hygiene standards of a barn owl. The bread absorbed the ale like a sponge with trust issues. It softened, swelled, and transformed from a jawbreaker into something vaguely edible. Was it tasty? In the right light, with a good mood and low expectations. Yes, kind of. It was warm, bready, and carried the gentle bitterness of fermented grain, which is to say it didn't actively offend the palate. This snack was especially popular with the working class, people who didn't have time for multiple courses or cutlery, but still needed calories that wouldn't fight back. Bread soaked in ale was quick, hearty, and just messy enough to feel like a real break from your daily chores. Sometimes people added extras, a sprinkle of herbs, a bit of cheese, or a fried egg if the hen felt generous that morning. On feast days, you might even get sop soaked in spiced ale, which basically meant the cook found a nutmeg shaving somewhere and got inspired. And like many medieval dishes, this one had dual purpose. Not only was it food, it was also a way to stretch ingredients. Bread too stale to chew, just soak it. Al starting to turn. Pour it on bread and pretend it's intentional. Waste was for amateurs. The only downside, it didn't travel well. Once soaked, the bread turned into a kind of sloshy porridge cube. Eat it quickly, or risk ending up with a mushy sponge in your bowl and a 1,000-year-old food metaphor for disappointment. Still, for a chilly evening by the fire, nothing beat a slice of ale, bread, mush, and a moment of peace. If you've ever looked at a slice of bread and thought this would be better submerged in alcohol, congratulations! You and the medieval upper class have something in common. Sops and wine were one of the more refined and bizarrely specific snacks of the Middle Ages. A dessert, technically, or perhaps an experience. The concept was simple. Take bread, ideally toasted or at least not completely stale, and dunk it in wine. Not just any wine, of course, usually mulled, sweetened or spiced wine. Something warm, fragrant, and barely hiding the fact that it had been sitting in a clay jug since last harvest. Once the bread was sufficiently drenched, it was served as a soft, spoonable delicacy. Nobles called it elegant. Everyone else quietly wondered if the cook had just run out of ideas. But this was not finger food. It was the kind of dish you ate with a spoon, very slowly, while pretending to be interested in lute music. It appeared at banquets, late-night feasts, and the kind of awkward dinner where no one wanted to talk about politics. So instead, they passed around soggy toast in a goblet. When done well, sops and wine were warm, comforting, and mildly intoxicating, a gentle end to a heavy meal. The wine added richness, the bread gave texture, and the spices made you feel like you were part of something fancier than it was. When done poorly, it was wet bread in a bowl. No amount of cinnamon could cover up the feeling that you were chewing on a medieval mistake. Sometimes dried fruits or nuts were added for flair, sometimes cheese, occasionally a whole egg. At that point, it stopped being a snack and became a culinary guessing game. Peasants made their own versions, usually using cheap vinegar or ale instead of wine. It wasn't dessert. It was dinner, or breakfast, or whatever you could call a meal that made you both full and confused. Still, sops and wine had staying power. They were warm, they were filling, and they gave medieval people a taste of indulgence, even if it did taste like sponge soaked in mulled regret. In the Middle Ages, dried fruit was a prized treat, sugary, exotic, and shelf-stable enough to survive an entire crusade. But let's be clear, this wasn't your modern trail mix with cute resealable packaging. Medieval dried fruit had one job: to last. Taste was optional. Texture, aggressively chewy. Dental damage, practically a guarantee. Let's start with the basics. You had your usual suspects: raisins, figs, dates, and if you were really fancy, imported prunes. These were fruits that had been sun-dried, smoke-dried, or in some cases, just forgotten on a windowsill until they no longer qualified as moist. They were wrinkled, tough, and alarmingly dense, kind of like an edible time capsule from last harvest. The upside: dried fruit was sweet, really sweet. Concentrated sugars turned these shriveled little things into medieval candy. Nobles loved them, monks hoarded them, and children treated them like rare loot from the kitchen. The downside: chewing them was like fighting your own jaw muscles. Figs came with seeds that doubled as medieval dental floss. Dates were sticky enough to glue your molars together. Raisins stuck in your teeth for hours. There was no such thing as snacking quietly. Still, dried fruit had its moments. It was used in pies, added to porridge, or chopped up and thrown into honey cakes to create the illusion of variety. Rich folks might wrap them in pastry, drizzle them with rose water, or soak them in wine like they were trying to impress a guest from Florence. For commoners, getting your hands on dried fruit was a special occasion, usually a holiday, a wedding, or the one day a year someone remembered you existed. When that happened, you'd eat it slowly, respectfully, possibly while hiding in the barn so you didn't have to share. Storage was easy. Dried fruit didn't spoil quickly and was often kept in little cloth sacks or clay pots. It hardened over time, yes, but that just turned it into a longer-lasting snack, or possibly a projectile, if you were creative and had younger siblings. In short, dried fruit was sweet, luxurious, and faintly dangerous. It stuck with you. Sometimes literally, you wake up hungry. You want something hearty, something fried, something that might bite back. Enter the blood pudding ball, a medieval snack so dense, so bold, so unapologetically iron-rich, it makes modern sausage rolls look like timid breadsticks. Born out of the noble tradition of using every part of the animal, these savory spheres were proof that waste not, want not, even if what you're not wasting is blood. Let's unpack it. First, you collect fresh animal blood, usually pig, though honestly any blood would do in a pinch. You then mix it with oats, onions, sweet that's beef fat, and spices. Once that morbid porridge reaches just the right level of grim stickiness, you shape it into balls and fry them in sizzling fat until the outside crisps up like it has something to prove. The result: dark, crispy orbs of protein-packed sustenance with a rich, earthy flavor, which is code for you'll taste iron and mystery for the rest of the day. They were best served hot, fresh from the skillet, though sometimes they were eaten cold if your appetite outweighed your fear of congealed fat. Nobles might dress them up with pepper, or serve them with eggs and ale. Peasants, they were just happy not to be chewing on boiled cabbage again. Blood pudding balls weren't elegant, but they were practical, easy to carry, high in calories, and alarmingly filling. If you ate 2, you could skip lunch. If you ate 4, you were probably a blacksmith or trying to win a dare. These snacks were common at fairs, markets, and roadside stalls where everything smelled like livestock and ambition. They were especially popular in colder months, because what warms the soul like fried coagulation. Of course, blood pudding balls weren't for everyone. Some folks didn't love the texture. Others didn't love the concept. But in a world where survival came first and flavor came somewhere around 12th, these meaty little morsels earned their place in the medieval junk food hall of fame. Forget everything you know about pancakes. These weren't fluffy stacks with maple syrup and whipped cream. Medieval pancakes were thinner, tougher, and cooked in enough lard to make your arteries consider early retirement. But they got the job done. And in a world where your other breakfast option was thin soup that's sad about its life, they were kind of a treat, made from a humble mix of flour, eggs, and water or ale. These pancakes were poured onto a sizzling iron griddle coated in bubbling pig fat. No non-stick pans, no portion control. You just ladled and hoped. The result, a flat, uneven circle with crispy, browned edges and a slightly chewy center. The kind of pancake that could survive a horseback ride and still be mostly edible when you arrived. Sometimes it was a little burnt. Sometimes it was a little raw. Sometimes, charmingly, both. Flavor depended on what you had. A splash of ale added a nice tang. A spoonful of honey, luxurious. A sprinkle of herbs or onions, adventurous. But most of the time, it was just pancake and grease, served hot and inhaled like you'd just run from a tax collector. These pancakes were democratic. Everyone ate them. Peasants, nobles, monks, merchants. Some layered them with cheese, some dunked them in broth, and others just rolled them up and called it a day. You could eat them sweet, savory, or scorched beyond recognition. And if you had leftovers, stack them up and pretend they were cake or armor. They were especially popular during Lent and other fasting days when meat was off limits. Pancakes became a loophole, fried, filling, and somehow both humble and indulgent. Plus, they made excellent vessels for disguising other ingredients that had no business being in your mouth. And while they might not have been beautiful, medieval pancakes had staying power. They didn't need praise. They just needed a hot pan and a willing stomach. Somewhere between a snack and a sacrament, we find the medieval wafer, a thin, crisp, suspiciously light biscuit that danced the line between dessert and dental challenge. Wafers were everywhere. Outside churches, at village fairs, in the hands of monks, and occasionally floating in your soup like a flat holy crouton. Let's clarify. We're not talking about chocolate-dipped, cream-filled delights. Medieval wafers were made of flour, water, eggs, and not much else. If you were feeling fancy, you could add a dash of honey or rose water, but most stuck with the basics. Thin batter poured onto hot metal wafer irons pressed between two scorching plates like a medieval panini press. The result, something that looked like it belonged in a communion ceremony and tasted like crispy paper with ambitions. Wafers were popular because they were portable, fast to make, and, best of all, they could be sold in massive quantities for a tidy profit. Vendors would set up outside churches on feast days, waving stacks of warm wafers at the faithful as they left Mass. Buy now. Sin later was not the slogan, but it was the general vibe. They were often shaped with religious symbols, floral patterns, or the vague imprint of a saint's face depending on the iron mold and how tired the baker was. These designs didn't enhance the flavor, but they did give you something to stare at while chewing thoughtfully and pretending you weren't disappointed. Structurally, wafers were delicate. They cracked if you looked at them wrong and shattered if you tried to break them cleanly. Storing them was a challenge, transporting them even more so, which made eating them outdoors a high-stakes affair involving crumbs, wind, and regret. Still, they were beloved. Light, crispy, and vaguely celebratory wafers were the medieval version of treating yourself without completely wrecking your digestion or your wallet. For nobles, they came stacked with fruit or layered with soft cheese. For everyone else, they were sold by the dozen in street stalls and eaten immediately before they disintegrated into edible confetti. Suckets. Even the name sounds sticky. This medieval treat was essentially fruit that had been boiled into submission, drowned in syrup, and sealed in a jar like a sweet little hostage. Think candied oranges, dates, or ginger coated in enough sugar to make your teeth tingle and your conscience whisper, "You shouldn't be eating this, but you did, because it was delicious and probably imported, and also you didn't have much else." Suckets weren't for the everyday peasant chewing his seventh onion of the week. No, this was elite-tier snacking, the kind of indulgence served in noble halls or gifted by the wealthy, to say I like you, but not enough to give you land. Sugar was expensive, and fruits weren't always in season, so suckets were reserved for special occasions like weddings or royal visits or Wednesday, if you were outrageously rich and out of control. The preparation process was ambitious. First, you'd boil the fruit in syrup, maybe honey, maybe refined sugar if your spice merchant owed you a favor, then you'd drain it. Let it dry a bit and repeat several times because once wasn't enough. You weren't just preserving fruit, you were declaring war on moisture itself. Eventually, the result was a glossy, jewel-toned bite of candy chewy, intense and so sweet it could probably be weaponized in large enough doses. Some versions were soft and syrupy, served in ornate glass jars. Others were dry, rolled in extra sugar and handed out as dainty little cubes of medieval hyperglycemia, but make no mistake, suckets came with status. It said you had access to sugar, trade routes, and at least one servant dedicated solely to stirring things that didn't want to be stirred. Sucket trays were passed around after banquets like edible gold coins. Guests took one piece, smiled graciously, and immediately regretted not grabbing three. As for commoners, they watched from the kitchen and maybe licked a spoon if no one was looking. So was it worth it? Honestly, yes. Suckets were one of the few medieval snacks that genuinely felt like dessert. It was rich, refined, and just extravagant enough to make up for the fact that dinner had included boiled something. Fried eel, the grand finale of medieval junk food. A dish so strangely beloved it made its way from peasant hearths to royal banquets without once stopping to ask, wait, am I really the best option here? Yes, it was. Eel was everywhere in medieval Europe. Rivers and streams practically writhed with them. And they were easy to catch, cheap to cook, and when fried, surprisingly crispy. Slippery when raw, bonier than expected, and shaped like the villain in a fish-themed horror story, eel was still eaten by the bucket load. Why? Because it was tasty, and more importantly, it wasn't turnips. To prepare it, you'd first have to catch the eel, usually at night when they slithered through shallow waters like sentient noodles. Then came the unpleasant task of skinning them, which was less like prepping a fish and more like wrestling a wet rope that didn't want to die. Once subdued, the eels were chopped, seasoned if you were feeling bold, and tossed into hot fat until the skin crisped up and the meat firmed into something vaguely appealing. The finished product, a crunchy, savory bite with a rich, slightly oily flavor like if calamari and chicken had an identity crisis in a tavern kitchen. Fried eel was served at fairs, feasts, roadside inns, and, believe it or not, during religious fasts. That's right. Eel wasn't technically meat, so it slipped through the dietary loopholes like itself. Monks ate it. Nobles flaunted it. Kings had it stuffed into pies and paraded across banquets like the sea serpent it always wanted to be. Sure, it had bones, lots of them, and yes, it occasionally wriggled long after death. But if you could get past that and the haunting feeling that you were eating a villain from a cautionary folktale, fried eel was genuinely delicious. Crispy skin, tender inside, and just greasy enough to make you feel like you were living a little too dangerously for a Wednesday afternoon. Today it might seem bizarre. Back then it was a delicacy. A slippery little miracle that kept bellies full and menus weird. So there you have it. A whirlwind tour through the weird, wonderful, and occasionally worrying world of medieval junk food. From sugary apple fritters and squeaky cheese curds to the surprisingly edible turnip pie and the ever-mysterious meat pasty, our ancestors knew how to snack with gusto, even if their ingredients were a bit adventurous. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What junk food from our era will people look back on in 500 years and find totally bizarre? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on this greasy journey into the past. If you had fun exploring these medieval munchies, please hit that like button. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next historical adventure. Until then, snack wisely and stay curious. Đánh giá câu chuyện này theo thang điểm